War, bloodshed, slaughter. That's how Jean-Henri Dunant saw the world before the Geneva Conventions.
Henry Dunant, who goes to a battlefield, the battlefield of Solferino in northern Italy, and he's appalled by what he sees. He sees more people dying from the injuries they received on the battlefield than the actual battlefield, right? He's appalled by the failure to protect.
He wrote a book about the horrors he witnessed called The Memory of Solferino, but he also proposed a new revolutionary solution.
And he goes back and he establishes the International Committee of the Red Cross. And from those early Geneva conversations, we start to see the emergence of these conventions, right? Early Geneva conventions, and Hague regulations is another body of norms that starts to emerge in this period after the 1850s.
And so after the atrocities of World War II, the world came together in 1949 to adopt the Geneva Convention.
The wounded and sick on the battlefield, the wounded and sick shipwrecked at sea, prisoners of war, and civilians, including civilians who are detained, including in occupation.
Another significant revision came in 1977 with the addition of two protocols, strengthening protections for victims of international and internal armed conflicts, including civil wars. These new additional protocols helped strengthen the conventions throughout many years and significantly changed how soldiers conducted themselves in battle.
Often what happens is, after there's a conflict, terrible things happen, and then the states get together and they try and come up with treaty regimes that will either prohibit or provide guidance for states to prevent some of the worst abuses of the previous war. So they're always very reactive. So what each successive Geneva Convention has done, and now we have protocols as well to the four Geneva Conventions, which were drafted after World War II, they've tried to strengthen the rules governing warring parties, understanding that war involves violence, but civilians should be entitled to immunity from violence. They can't be deliberately targeted. And the parties should do all that they can to avoid harming civilians and the civilian infrastructure. The rules also provide protections for combatants. Combatants can't be subjected to painful ways of death, for example. So certain blinding weapons, for example, are prohibited by the laws of war, not by the Geneva Conventions themselves, but by specialized treaties. All of this is an attempt to focus conflict on soldiers fighting soldiers and focusing on military objectives and trying to protect civilians and the civilian infrastructure, civilian populations.
Some conflicts today are still fought in compliance with the Geneva Conventions.
Ukraine is really to be commended. There have been some allegations of breaches, particularly when it comes to Russian prisoners of war being mistreated. But in general, Ukraine has done a really incredible job of exercising its war powers in compliance with the Geneva Conventions, even in the face of terrible breaches by Russia. So in that respect, I think Ukraine really understands that its legitimacy in the eyes of the international community depends upon it being in compliance with those treaties. And so the treaties provide a set of standards for Ukraine and other states that want to be seen as legitimate warfighting entities.
Today, the Geneva Conventions continue to be upheld by many organizations, including the long-lasting International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement, including several organizations within.
For example, when 3 young female hostages were being transferred from a designated terrorist group in Gaza to home, the intermediary was the ICRC.
The Geneva Conventions and the ICRC also played a role in the Falklands Wars in 1982. Both the British and Argentinian troops who were in conflict during the war adhered to the treatment of prisoners of war, offered medical help to wounded soldiers in combat, avoided chemical or biological weapons, and ensured that civilians were not directly impacted.
these organizations are working to raise more awareness of the conventions?
With respect to cyber warfare and AI, I think you've seen the emergence of new standards of protection, especially in Europe, more thought given to privacy laws, and how they intersect with the private sector. You also see more a movement or a shift towards corporate accountability, again, and different legal and regulatory frameworks to support that. And so I think on a variety of levels, you are starting to see more enforcement. And I think it's also greater awareness of this body of law and this body of practice. I think you also see a greater movement in the transitional justice space, the recognition that it's not just international accountability and courts and tribunals that are a form of justice, but also truth commissions, through vetting and lustration processes and due diligence to ensure that alleged perpetrators do not remain in government, and memorialization efforts and education, especially in many of the situations I've worked in. There's been a lot of funding for civil society educational programs to raise awareness of among affected communities of their rights, of their human rights, but also the international humanitarian law and the protections that it affords them, for them to be able to understand and process some of the experiences that they've had, as well as the way that the laws protect them.
However,
but in fact, most wars these days involve not states, but non-state actors. And the problem is that non-state actors don't sign treaties. Only states can sign treaties. So our biggest problem in many ways across the globe is not that states aren't implementing these treaties. Part of the bigger problem is that non-state actors, so armed groups in different countries, are not abiding by the convention. So for many states, that feels unfair. They say, well, we've signed a treaty, but these non-state actors haven't signed the treaty because they can't, they're not a state, and they don't abide by the rules. And so I think our biggest challenge is actually ensuring that non-state armed groups are aware that they have obligations under the Geneva Conventions and that they can be held responsible for serious breaches of international law like war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide.
so where do we start?
Well, we start by training and dissemination. Soldiers can't obey rules that they don't know about. It is by training soldiers well on the rules and making the rules second nature.
Awareness, what we look at cultural considerations, we look at, as I was saying, size of the groups, legal framework based on Islamic law, Sharia law. We have experts at the ICRC who disseminate IHL through Sharia-informed methods.
So I think the biggest thing the Geneva Convention has done is that it's given us a language that says, here are the rules that apply to lawfare. And people know
The Geneva
those rules.
Conventions
So once you have a
revolutionized the
language, you
conduct
can
of
start to
warfare
implement
by
it.
establishing legal rights and responsibilities
Touchstone on humanity,
for
that
soldiers,
these people should
prisoners,
never be
and
the
civilians,
subject of
which
harm.
continue to make a game-changing impact on the world today. Transitional justice efforts through courts, truth commissions, and civil society education programs help rebuild societies and promote accountability. However, the ongoing conflicts around the world remind us that laws alone cannot prevent violence. So the true test lies in the global community's commitment to upholding these protections and prioritizing human rights above political interests. War will always bring destruction, but the Geneva Conventions stand as a promise that even in conflict, humanity must prevail.